Good evening. This is Nate Pamplin, Policy Director with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. It's approaching 7 o'clock here. So we'll just give it a couple more minutes to see if other folks join the webinar, and then we'll get started. Stay tuned. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Nate Pamplin. I'm the Policy Director with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Really appreciate you all taking the time to join us today to talk a little bit about our draft budget proposals for the next legislative session in 2019, as well as our agency request legislation. Before I dive into the meat of the presentation, I want to turn it over to Molly Spiller, who's with our consulting firm Ross Strategic, to provide a little bit of overview about how to ask questions and use the features here of the webinar.
Thanks, Nate. So we're going to start off by quickly walking through the logistics for how to participate today. So I first want to note that we are recording this webinar. So the recording and the presentation will be available on WDFW's website tomorrow. All attendees are muted, so you won't be able to speak during the webinar, so you should be able to listen via your computer or your telephone if you've called in. We'll be holding a question and answer session following Nate's presentation today, but we encourage you to send your questions throughout the presentation. So on this slide here, it walks you through how to participate. So as you can see, you'll either select the computer, audio, or the phone call option. If you've selected the phone call option, make sure to enter your access code and audio PIN to join. And then at the bottom of this slide here, you'll see there's a questions box. So please use this box to type in your questions, and then Nate will read out those questions during the question and answer period as best as possible for how much time that we have. So DFW will answer questions depending on how much time we have left in the presentation. If you have questions on how to participate, you can also use that questions box and we'll help you with any logistical issues as they arise. So with that, I'll pass it back over to Nate to begin today's webinar.
Great, thanks, Molly. So this evening we'll walk through a few items. The first, I'll present an overview of our budget and some of the budget balancing decisions that we had to make for this current biennium. I'll also explain the proviso that the legislature included in our budget in 2017 that directed us to do a bunch of the analyses here on our budget and our long-term funding plan. Then we'll dive into our operating budget proposals for next biennium, as well as our agency request legislation. But before diving into all the numbers, I think it's really important to just remind ourselves about the work that the department does. We manage hunting opportunities. We're involved in the recovery of state and federally listed species. We manage 81 hatcheries that benefit commercial fisheries and rec fishing. And we're involved in managing 33 wildlife areas and 700 boat launch sites. We manage watchable wildlife opportunities, and we have staff that engage in reviewing forest practice applications. We have staff that monitor vessels for aquatic invasive species, and we're involved in fish passage, project design, and technical assistance. We have staff that respond to dangerous wildlife complaints, and we're involved in salmon restoration projects. We're ready to respond to oil spills and assisting injured and harmed wildlife, and we're involved in hydraulic project approvals to permit construction projects that affect the flow of waters in the state. So each of those activities has an entire story behind it. Our budget is based on decades of incremental budget decisions made by the legislature. Each activity has that story. There's a statutory basis, an actual legal requirement for us to do the work that I just described. In some cases, it's also incorporated in contracts. In other cases, it's actually case law, where a court has mandated that the department conduct this work. Each activity is comprised of a number of different fund sources, and each one of those fund sources and each one of those activities tends to have its own advocacy group that was there in the first place to provide us that authority and provide us that funding. To distill it down, the department has a two-part mission, and that is to conserve fish and wildlife and habitat and provide sustainable opportunities for hunting, fishing, rec fishing, commercial fishing, and watchable wildlife. Our $440 million per biennium operating budget is displayed on this pie chart. As you can see, about a little over 20% of our funding comes from the state general fund. That's the general taxpayers' general tax money that's collected by the state. Almost, well, a little over 25% of our budget is comprised of our state wildlife account. And that account has two main components. There is a component that's where all of the hunting and fishing license revenue is deposited. And then there's 25 additional accounts that are very restricted. And those include things like the personalized license plate account, which goes to the management of non-game wildlife, or the two-pole endorsement. So each one of those has a very specific story and specific requirements for those accounts. Another almost quarter, a little over a quarter of our budget is from the general fund federal. And so this is all of our federal contracts. Some of these are like the Pittman-Robertson Fund or Dingell-Johnson funds, which are collections of excise taxes from firearms or fishing tackle that goes to the management of the state's fish and wildlife. In other instances, it might be federal ratepayer money from Bonneville Power Administration contracts or other contracts for endangered species work. Likewise, general fund local is typically comprised of mitigation contract from public utility districts. And then we have a catch-all category here of about 10% of our funding. There's just a variety of other smaller fund sources. Overall, there's about 50 different fund sources and about 3,000 different budget codes that the department uses to track and monitor the department's budget. Our license revenue is shown on this slide, where fishing license revenue is more than half of the revenue that's brought in. Hunting, we bring in about $46 million per biennium from hunting. And with both hunting and fishing licensing revenue combined as match for the federal grants of Dingell-Johnson and Pittman-Robertson that I mentioned earlier, that comprises about a third of our overall budget. So a really important part of how the department is funded is through user participation. But likewise, 2/3 of the budget is also funded by general taxpayers and ratepayers and other users. So let's look at another way to describe the department's budget is just kind of looking at the overall economic impact. And when we looked at studies from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service, and they show that the economic activity in Washington associated with work that we conduct or influence it brings in about $4.3 billion to the state. Now, certainly there are a number of other agencies and entities that also contribute to that, other public land managers, for instance. But I think it definitely shows how important the wildlife economy is to the state of Washington. In 2017, the Department of Revenue released a report based on some of the hunting and fishing participation data, and they showed that about $330 million per biennium is deposited into the state general fund from activities associated with hunting and fishing and outdoor rec. Well, when you look at that, the department is appropriated $94 million a biennium of state general fund, again, about 20% of our budget. That's almost, you could look at it as that's a 350% return on investment. So for every dollar invested in the state general fund that goes into WDFW, we leverage that with other fund sources and bring in $3.50 to the state general tax revenue sources. I want to clarify, all of our hunting and fishing license revenue goes into the state wildlife account, but this is just trying to say for the Department of Revenue, within the just state general fund, we see a 350% return on investment. So let's take a closer look at general fund state over the past few biennia. In 2007 to 09, the department was appropriated $110 million per biennium. Then we had the Great Recession hit and further reductions where we saw a loss of about $50 million pulled out of the department's base. Since then, it's grown with time, but each one of those bienniums has stories of either fund shifts, or sometimes there might be an enhancement that might be one time, or it's a permanent enhancement. In other cases, there's a reduction. So this is just showing the net result. When we dissect that a little bit further and we back out fund shifts or one-time infusion, and we look at what happened to the kind of net buying power that has been lost since the 07-09 biennium, we're down about $25 million. When you apply an inflation rate to adjust for that, if we were to bring this in today's dollars, that would be about $32 or $33 million. That number that I just said it's coincidence that it lines up with the problem statement, but I think it also shows that, yeah, this is kind of what has happened to the department for just maintaining our current level of services. We have not fully been restored from the reductions that we took associated with the Great Recession. In addition, hunting and fishing license revenue is not keeping pace with appropriations. The state legislature has the authority to set hunting and fishing licenses. What happens is, for instance, when there is an across-the-board salary increase for all state employees, the legislature will approve that higher spending authority. However, when you haven't adjusted the revenue behind it, we're not able to keep pace. And so that's what we end up calling a structural deficit, where we have the permission to spend money that's actually not occurring. It's actually not money that we have other than what's in account balance. So let's take a look at what was the budget environment that led us into this situation. During the 2017 legislative session, we projected a $25 million shortfall. It was a combination of both that structural deficit that I just described in the state wildlife account, and we had about $13 million of costs associated with maintaining fishing opportunity. Combination of Endangered Species Act requirements, increasing staff costs, as well as we've had flat federal funding, in particular for things like Mitchell Act, which funds some of the mitigation hatcheries on the Columbia River. Our proposed solutions back in 2017 were primarily to solve this through a license fee increase. The legislature did not pass the recreational fee increase for a variety of reasons, but we did not propose general fund at that time because the legislature was still grappling with the McCleary decision, and there was really specific instructions to the agencies to not submit general fund state requests. They did, however, partially address our budget shortfall with a one-time funding of a little over $10 million of state general fund just for this biennium. So that funding does expire next June, but it was incredibly important for us to try to balance the budget for this current biennium. The legislature also passed $2 million of additional cuts that were added into that budget, bringing our total problem statement to $27 million. I'll just briefly touch on this. We were able to balance the budget this current biennium, again, because of the one-time general fund infusion. We ended up managing our wildlife account to a 1-month reserve. Typically, we try to manage that account with a 2-month reserve, but by budgeting more aggressively, that put 1 month of reserve out in the field and try to maintain $3.2 million worth of services. We also implemented a vacancy rate model across all of our programs. Typically, that money would have gone towards equipment purchases. So the net result is, okay, well, what went away? Well, it's about $4.5 million of equipment purchases for the biennium. We also made sure that all of our fund sources, all 50 of those fund sources I mentioned earlier, are paying their fair share of administrative costs. And we tapped into restricted fund balances where that work was consistent with that fund source. So we ended up still having $6 million of cuts to balance the budget. That included stopping the purchase of triploid trout for planting into area lakes, as well as we reduced, for instance, oyster seeding. We had some management reductions, et cetera. So $6 million of cuts to balance the budget, along with the other suite of tools that I mentioned earlier. So with the $10 million of state general fund, the legislature directed us in a proviso. And so this is a directive written in the budget for the department. Sometimes you'll see a proviso where the legislature will say, well, here's $200,000 to do, this particular research, or this amount of hatchery production to benefit killer whales, for instance. Well, this proviso was really more of an administrative requirements that had us do 3 things. They asked us to do a performance assessment. We needed to do a zero-based budget analysis, and we needed to write a long-term funding plan. So in other words, Department of Fish and Wildlife, you guys need to go back, find efficiencies and eliminate waste, repurpose your existing funding from lower priorities to higher priorities, and then come up with a plan and submit that to the legislature on how to secure stable funding. We've taken that work to heart, and we've really invested a lot of time this past year to respond to that proviso, and it's led to some really healthy conversations both within the agency as well as with the governor's office, and we're now starting to have conversations with individual legislators. For the performance assessment, we contracted a consulting group called Matrix last fall, and they were charged with evaluating the agency across 3 very broad areas. One was to understand our operating budget, the revenue, and the deficit. They were charged with looking at our management structure and decision making, as well as just our overall administrative operations. Matrix found that the department is employing many best practices in our management and operations. We use strategic planning. Our agency's organization structure is based on different resource programs with a strong emphasis on a regional focus. Conservation occurs in the field, and that's where the majority of our staff are based. We also focus on core program areas, and that the staffing levels within the Department of Fish and Wildlife are on par with some of the other sister natural resource agencies for some of the central support services for IT or fiscal, HR, and contracts. Matrix also found that there were some incremental changes that we could do to enhance our operations and maintenance. They recommended that our Fish and Wildlife Commission, which is appointed by the governor, it's a 9-member citizen volunteer board, provide greater oversight of the department. They also recommended some minor organizational realignments, and they saw that we needed to enhance our outreach, education, and transparency in our decision making. They also strongly suggested that we enhance our performance culture and develop performance measures and publish them. Do so in a manner where the public can see what we've said is important, measure our progress to achieving those results. And finally, Matrix acknowledged that the department does have this structural deficit, and we do need to have a need for a long-term funding plan. For the zero-based budget, what we did is we divided the agency into our major outcome areas. Oftentimes, when a state agency, and the way we've handled it in the past, is when someone would ask us to describe our budget, we would organize that answer based on our internal organizational structure. Here, what we've done is followed the legislative proviso and organized our budget based on major outcome areas, areas that the public care about. Nobody cares about how we're internally structured or whether or not we have a fish program or habitat program. What they care about is whether or not we have hatcheries and whether or not we're managing the fishing opportunities and what are we doing to ensure that the habitat is being conserved. So within each of these outcome areas, we have different activities that are comprised of the work to achieve that outcome, and we assigned our budget accordingly. We looked at our flexible funding and use that as a way to try to determine and how to help balance the budget. And I'll dive into that in a bit more detail here in a second. The third piece of the proviso was for us to develop a long-term funding plan. And we have that drafted. We've been working very closely with a new advisory group called our Budget and Policy Advisory Group, comprised of fishers and hunters and land trusts and outdoor enthusiasts and conservationists. We have members representing the counties and the business sector and ag and timber interests. It's been incredibly helpful for us, and they've taken a tremendous amount of time to crawl through our budget with us and provide us some guidance. We don't have consensus yet on the long-term funding plan, but some of the draft recommendations that are emerging is that the department should pursue increase the amount of funding and ensure that it's stable. There's recognition that most of the funding for the department should come from a broad-based source, such as the general fund, and that revenue from licenses and other fees should supplement our work, but really rely on that broad-based funding. Our long-term funding plan is due to the legislature in September. So I want to contrast a little bit about how we developed budgets in the past and what we're doing now through the benefit of the proviso. Previously, we developed our budget based on just an incremental need. Our executive management team, about this time of year, maybe starting in about April, would have looked at, okay, well, what are some of the enhancements? What are the most important things that we can do to meet our mission? And there wasn't really an evaluation of our existing expenditures, of our existing programs, unless we were in a severe cut mode. We would submit those requests to the governor's office in the fall. The governor would roll their budget forward, and then usually about mid-February, the legislature would really start rolling up their sleeves on going through the budget, and we'd start seeing questions about, hey, what happens, Fish and Wildlife, if you don't get the funding that you're requesting? Or what if we cut you by $10 million? Well, what we had previously have done in response to those types of questions is we would answer solely within the fund source that the legislature was asking about. So if there was a reduction of $10 million of general fund, we would look at where are we investing general fund within the department and essentially offer reductions that were proportionate within how our programs are structured. We didn't take a look at the highest priority needs across other fund sources and look at how can we utilize flexible fund sources to serve up cuts that would represent the lowest priority. We served up cuts that were lowest priority, but only within that fund source and typically as a proportionate cut to a program. So certainly using that methodology, I think it's fair to say some accuse the department of essentially hiding the ball. So what's different for this round? Well, we have the benefit of the organizational assessment. We're an independent consultant firm, came in to look at the department and said, you know what, the structural deficit is real, as well as there's no major negative fundings on how we're being stewards of public's financial resources. We also have the benefit of the zero-based budget analysis, where we're including all of our potentially flexible fund sources. We ended up creating what we called outcome leadership teams. Again, going back to that zero-based budget analysis where we divided up the agency's work into 8 areas, instead of having just a single program describe their activity, we said, no, here's the work that the public's expecting, and let's have all the programs that contribute to that work get in a room, talk about what they're doing, working cross-program, and then let's identify what's the lowest priority work that might be at risk, or is there work that we should just go ahead and cut so that we can repurpose that money into something that's a higher priority. So ultimately, we were able to develop a true carry-forward level budget. Our budget that we're submitting to the legislature this fall, or to the governor's office this fall, and ultimately to the legislature, is the budget we will implement if we don't have any new investments. We also had the benefit of the Budget and Policy Advisory Group and the benefit of working on this long-term funding plan. I mentioned a little bit about the flexibility of funding, and it's worth maybe just going into a bit more detail. So there's essentially, this slide just shows a spectrum of flexible funding, from fund sources that we could use for funding almost anything within Title 77. That's the title within the state legal framework for our agents, for the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Or there's further down on the spectrum of just very prescriptive funding such as if we got a contract to do enforcement work to look at southern resident killer whale vessel interactions, we can either accept that money or not take the money, but I couldn't repurpose that federal contract for managing a wildlife area, for instance. Whereas some of the fund sources, like I said, could be used for almost anything under Title 77, and some of them are a little bit of a hybrid. And we described, well, certain federal contracts, for instance, like Pittman-Robertson, can be used for managing wildlife areas or can be used for managing hunting programs. And so we consider that potentially flexible because while it couldn't fund everything in the agency, it does have enough room where we could apply it across a couple of our different outcome areas. So let's take a look into what we're facing for this next legislative session. We know that our current spending on our state wildlife account is above the projected revenue, a little over $4 million. Similar to, we have a number of provisos and restricted accounts where we're spending above revenue. And we know that we balance our current biennial budget with almost $20 million of one-time budget decisions, all of which will need to be reversed or expired. We also have the Columbia River Salmon Steelhead endorsement that is set to expire at the end of this fiscal year, and we anticipate a certain amount of lost purchasing power due to inflation. So our best estimate right now, in order to maintain our current services, is we would need $32.9 million for next biennium. So when we developed our budget, we went back to the core. We looked at our agency mission and mandate. We applied the proviso criteria and other criteria that our executive management team developed, considering factors like the conservation mandate, and let's think about long-term investments. Let's prioritize work for native species over non-native species. And ultimately, we needed to identify almost $33 million of reductions. What we did is we created 2 categories. One was, are there further reductions that we take through next June so that we minimize and reduce the amount of the need that we'd have next biennium? And what are those activities that are really important to us they would be at risk, but let's go ahead and ask for revenue to essentially buy back those currently funded services. So our potential solutions include asking for general fund. The legislature had provided us $10.1 million for this current biennium, so we have that certainly on the table. We're asking to make the Columbia River Salmon Steelhead endorsement permanent. That's $3.3 million, and we have a placeholder for a recreational fee increase, and I'll go into more detail about a couple options that we're pursuing. For the planned reductions for this fiscal year, includes the following. We're proposing that we shift the hatchery production from the Natchez hatchery to other facilities. We hope to be able to find where we can maintain that current level of production and then be able to close down one hatchery, but hopefully not have an impact for angling opportunity. We would, as we've already have done temporarily for this current biennium of stopping our triploid trout purchase, this would have that activity cease next biennium as well. There's a number of IT staff efficiencies that we're are implementing, as well as reducing some of our habitat restoration work, backing off some of our grants that we issue to volunteer groups, and we're reducing our fish pamphlet production because we've just released a new Fish Washington app that anglers can have on their smartphone to find out real time what the rules are. So in total, we've identified almost $3 million in reductions that we're proposing to take this fiscal year. So shifting into more detail about what our requests will be, I've divided this up into two categories. Just a quick mention here, within a budget, there's one category that's called maintenance level and another category within state budgeting called performance level. Maintenance level is for those kind of requests to just cover the cost of doing business. Your power bill went up. In our case, oftentimes it's fish food prices went up, or a payment in lieu of taxes on our wildlife areas. Pretty standard, but very important requests that we need to submit to the legislature. Our performance level requests typically even undergo a higher degree of scrutiny. And in this instance, for the purpose of this presentation, I've divided them up into services that we're asking the legislature for us to maintain, and then also go through some decision packages for strategic enhancements to try to fully meet the department's mandate and achieve our mission. So those at-risk and buyback proposals include a little over $4 million of state general fund to staff our ability to respond to wildlife conflicts. So this would include backfilling the hunting fee component with state general fund for crop payments to landowners. If we don't have this funding, we would end up having to reduce our wildlife conflict staffing from 22 FTEs, so full-time equivalent, 22 employees to 8 employees, and it would reduce our enforcement program by 3 FTEs. Part of this is also that we're anticipating a decline in Pittman-Robertson funding, which is used to help fund some of our conflict specialists. We have another proposal to maintain our services associated with public health and sanitary shellfish, where we have our 6 FTEs of our enforcement staff that patrol shellfish beds as well as the marketplace to make sure that fishery is conducted in a sustainable manner and that the product is originated from shellfish beds that are open. We also have a request for almost $3 million of state general fund to maintain land management. This would go towards sustaining our work for weed control and wildlife area planning and some of our science support. Forest health is a big deal for us. We've identified this as something that would be at risk, but boy, we'd sure like to keep making some of the progress that we've been doing on addressing the almost 250,000 acres of forest land habitat types within 1 million acres of our portfolio, as well as real estate services. We have a request for $3.2 million of state wildlife to maintain hunting services. This would include activities that go towards game species research and our ability to manage both harvest data as well as population survey data. Without new funding, we would have to result in reducing our pheasant hunting opportunities and also some hunter education services. The next request is for almost $2 million of state wildlife revenue to maintain our customer service presence. This funding would go towards 13 FTEs that are distributed both in our regional offices and here at headquarters, as well as this would fund our current service where we have 24/7 access for hunters and fishers and outdoor enthusiasts to call up the agency and ask us questions. We have an after-hours call center that we've utilized, and without getting new funding, that's something that we identified that we would put at risk. We have a request for $3.5 million of state general fund to maintain some of our work associated with our conservation activities. This would go towards our climate change capacity, our species recovery efforts, maintaining our vigilance on aquatic invasive species, and retrieving derelict fishing gear. We have a request that's a combination of $9 million, both general fund and state wildlife account, to maintain fishing and hatchery production. You can see the various hatcheries that would be at risk of closure if we don't secure new funding. In addition to those hatcheries, we would be really reducing our work associated with warm water game fish management, conducting rehab on lakes and streams to prep those bodies of water for trout releases. Some of our work associated with steelhead monitoring and ESA compliance, as well as reducing recreational shellfish opportunities and some of our bottom trawl surveys for rockfish. In total, that funds about 40 FTEs. I already mentioned that the Columbia River salmon steelhead endorsement is set to expire. That endorsement allows folks to fish for salmon within the main Columbia River basin and tributaries. It generates $3.3 million, and that money is used to fund 3 enforcement officers. About 50 staff in the fish program have a component of their work funded by this endorsement, totaling about 10 FTE equivalents, and that really just sustains some of those expanded fishing opportunities in the Columbia. Within each of those different proposals, there's an indirect component. And in total, when you sum up the indirect across all of those other proposals, it comes to $6.3 million. And we prioritize, well, where would we, if we don't get funding or we get partial funding, well, where would we cut in terms of administrative services? And we looked at reductions, about 25 FTEs that would be within our IT work unit, staffing in the director's office, and our HR work unit. So that's a summary of the funding that's that $30 million problem statement, that funding that would be at risk, that we're requesting to be made whole. Now let's shift to some of the other enhancements. And going through the zero-based budget analysis and in conversations with our commission and with our advisory group, we're hearing, there's a lot of work and a lot of expectations above what we're currently able to deliver. And I was just out with staff up in north central Washington and at our hatchery up in northern part of Region 4 off of Highway 20, our Marble Mount hatchery. And folks consistently will say, we're doing the best that we can. The hatchery previously was at 9 FTEs, they're down to 4. They're doing the best that they can, but they have, capacity to do more, and there's a real need. We've got really dedicated staff that are doing the best with the resources that they have, but there's definitely other areas that we see that we could do better in terms of meeting our mission. So we've identified a request of almost $1 million to partner with the regional fisheries enhancement groups. We've identified a request for almost $15 million of state general fund to enhance our conservation capacity. And this will benefit not only non-game, but this will benefit game species and food fish and game fish. This money would go towards our capacity to partner with local government, to conduct more habitat protection and restoration with a real emphasis on watershed health. We know that half of Washington is in private land ownership, and our private landowners are doing a tremendous job providing wildlife habitat. And are there things that we can do to further assist them to continue to provide good habitat quality or even enhance it further? We've seen the importance of conducting conservation in that urban wildland interface. This is an area that the department in previous budget cuts has retreated from. And as the human population continues to expand in Washington, there's more and more development. We need to be able to provide technical assistance and look at those conservation opportunities within that interface. We also have a tremendous list, 250 species of greatest conservation need. And what is the work that we can be doing now to try to keep those common species common before they're depleted, before they're so imperiled that they end up on the Endangered Species Act, which has a further financial burden on federal agencies and state agencies. Private landowners are impacted with additional regulatory burden. So this request has a number of statewide components, but really it's trying to invest in our regional capacity to bolster our work that we do on conservation. We've identified an enhancement request of $3.6 million of general fund to go towards lands operations and maintenance. As the department's acquired new properties, oftentimes those properties are just the existing wildlife area manager now has another work unit to try to manage, further stretching their budget. So this would help increase staffing on those wildlife areas, as well as we have a number of grazing leases, and we have one rangeland ecologist that's helping work with wildlife area managers and our permittees on what's the grazing strategy on those wildlife areas. So this would be to offer some support there. We have a need to try to further invest in weed control, and we've identified a need for a greater enforcement presence at our wildlife areas and boat launch sites. We have a request identified for enhancing fishing opportunities, about $1 million invested for hatchery production. We have needs to address the Endangered Species Act compliance in Puget Sound. It really has to do with the Puget Sound Chinook Harvest Management Plan that is our Endangered Species Act take permit for us to be able to exercise fisheries on threatened salmon stocks. And in the Columbia River, there was recently a new biological opinion on the Mitchell Act funded hatcheries. And so we have some additional needs that we need to meet in those facilities. We also see a need for increasing enforcement and to maintain that mobile application that I mentioned earlier. The number one complaint among hunters in the state of Washington is, where can I go? And we've identified an enhancement to support hunting opportunities. This funding would go towards staffing to work with landowners to understand what are those barriers of why did the gates go up, and what can we do to partner with landowners to make sure that the public continues to have a hunting opportunity. And if it's not the full public, well then what can we do from is there another type of program that a landowner that would meet a landowner's needs where they would still provide some hunting opportunity. We also see a need to increase our enforcement presence during the hunting seasons and a need to increase wildlife conflict response capacity. And so again, that totals a little over right at $3.5 million. And similar to what I went through with the at-risk proposals, each one of these enhancements has indirect funding. And we looked at, well, where would we invest the indirect associated with each of these enhancements? What we prioritize is let's invest further in outreach and education and marketing. There's just a huge need, a high demand, whether it's having staff at sportsman shows or it's engaging on social media or being available at schools, that community presence where folks can talk about the importance of fish and wildlife conservation or work with the public on recruiting them into the hunting and fishing activities. We also saw a need for increasing our capacity with our HR work unit and providing quality training for our staff. And there was a number of other recommendations in the matrix report that we'd like to fund. We have a placeholder for work that would go towards recovering southern resident killer whales. Governor Inslee had established a task force this winter, and they're currently looking at the various threats for killer whales and what are the activities that the state agencies can do about it. We have a placeholder here because we're still waiting to see what the task force ultimately recommends, but typically the type of work that we would do that would benefit killer whales include our enforcement patrols where killer whales are around in the San Juan Islands area, increasing Chinook increasing Chinook hatchery production, increasing our work on protecting habitat and restoring habitat. Again, killer whales tend to really focus on Chinook, and so those would be the species we'd want to emphasize, as well as what can we do to benefit Chinook from a fish passage perspective, and are there things that we can do to address prey competition to allow more Chinook and other species of concern onto the spawning grounds and produce more prey for killer whales. This slide just summarizes all of those draft proposals. So in order to maintain current services, we're requesting $30.4 million across those different fund sources, and all of our enhancement packages total to $28 million. When you add those with the other kind of costs associated with fish food or with pilt, our total draft proposal right now is almost $64 million. A couple things to note. First, we're currently looking at trying to put the majority, almost 2/3 of this funding request on the state general fund, with a third coming from fees. Secondly, as we go through and we talk to the commission and the governor's office, as the proposals shift, for instance, if we end up dropping or reducing one of the budget proposals, well, that might reduce the need for the fee increase. Likewise, if there's a substantial increase, for instance, on southern resident killer whales, well, does that bump up the state general fund request, or does it displace one of the other activities? So all this to say is this is draft, it's in flux, and we're eager to hear your input. So when we look at our agency request legislation, so shifting from budget to some of our policy ideas, one bill that we're working on is modifying the discounts associated with disabled residents. Currently, the eligibility is very specific for disabled persons, and so this would expand that eligibility, but would also adjust the discount, because what we're hoping to achieve is a simpler process, easier folks to register and be eligible for the discount, but also have it being done in a way that might be budget neutral for the department and in sync with what other natural resource agencies offer as a discount. We ran a bill last year, it didn't pass, but I think there's some really important components there, and that is what we hear a lot of. Instead of, hey, trying to increase fees, are there things that we can do to just recruit more people to the sport? And so we have a number of ideas. For instance, offering hunter ed graduates a discount on their first license, or removing the requirement that those anglers participating in the Lowland Lakes trout opener in April must have an annual license. Well, maybe let's just offer them a temporary license, see if we can get those individuals excited about fishing. Maybe they'll come back and buy another temporary license, or ideally an annual license. There is a number of ideas that we've identified in the matrix report, as well as talking with staff at the governor's office about how we could try to be more efficient and streamlined on how we budget. So there's a few improvements that we could pursue there. It would require a bill passed by the legislature to make the Columbia River Salmon Steelhead endorsement permanent. And then we have two options that we're contemplating for a recreational license fee bill. One option is just to pursue a modest across-the-board fee increase. So for every item that's offered in the recreational license catalog, increase it by 12 to 15%. Again, that number's in flux depending on ultimately what are those investments that folks want us to pursue. For context, if we were to imply inflation to the last time the department had the legislature amended our fees, which was 2011, we'd likely see an inflationary rate of a 23% increase. So if we were to go through and have adjusted fees, if the legislature adjusted fees every couple years tied to the consumer price index, our fees would be 23% higher now than they were in 2011. So that's where I think that context is, I think, between 12 and 15% is pretty modest and below the increase that we would have seen if we had an inflationary clause in place. Certainly, we're very concerned about pricing hunters and anglers out of participating, and we're concerned about the optics of proposing a fee increase when there isn't a commensurate increase in opportunity. Those are two very tough situations for the department to be in, and it's been a real challenge articulating that to individuals where there are those concerns. The other option for a recreational license fee bill is to just offer a single charge, a stamp, if you will, that would go on all recreational buyers. So perhaps it's $10 for an annual license and $3 for a temporary license. So what this would do in comparing the two options, if someone is an avid hunter and angler and they're buying $200 worth of products, or let's say $250 worth of products, well, a 15% increase, well, it goes up, doing the math in my head here, another, $30, $35, as opposed to option two, which is just that $10 increase. As opposed to if someone doesn't participate in a lot of the hunting and fishing opportunities in the state, and perhaps only buy their freshwater fishing license, that would be the idea of the stamp in option two would be a significantly higher percentage increase for that customer. Still only $10, but the percent increase would be significant. So just wanted to call out those two comparisons, because it does affect people differently based on how many products they might purchase. We're also looking at a couple other license amendments that would probably be in that bill. One idea is to eliminate the 2- and 3-day temporary angling license. So this would shift, either an angler would buy multiple 1-day temporary licenses, or ideally shift to purchase an annual license. So looking at our timeline and what lies ahead, we have our next meeting with our Budget and Policy Advisory Group on the 1st of August here in Olympia. Then we're presenting these proposals to the Fish and Wildlife Commission on August 9th and 10th here in Olympia. The products for the proviso, as well as our draft budget and policy requests, are due to the governor's office and the legislature in early September. And then we'll be conducting likely another round of public meetings. Our new director starts on August 1st, and likely will be going out and about and starting not only have an opportunity to meet the new director, but also initiate some of our work on strategic planning for the next biennium and getting the public's input on that process. So just to summarize, and then we'll jump into some of the questions. Our budget challenges in 2017 and 19, this current biennium, were real, and the majority of the solutions were one time that expire on June 30th of 2019. The departments implemented a number of efficiencies and operational improvements. We're starting to work on our budget and talking about it internally, as well as now with the public, about what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, and not talk about what we're doing in terms of the administrative programs. We've developed a true carry forward level budget, and we're trying to propose realistic solutions that carry through that value of the department's funding should come from a broad-based funding source like the State General Fund, and user fees could supplement the work of the department, but don't have the department just be completely reliant on license fees. We've now in this phase of iterations of looking at our decision packages with the agency request legislation, and talking with our commission and getting their guidance and ultimately approval on what are those draft proposals that we submit to the governor's office. We have a public opinion survey that we posted at our website. If you go to About WDFW, and then underneath that tab, there's a 2019 budget development slide or a website. And on that website, there is a link to a SurveyMonkey where we're asking the public to weigh in on all of the material I just presented, asking folks to help us understand your thoughts on the different budget proposals, to rank the different lists, to solicit your feedback on the two recreation license fee bill concepts that I presented. In addition, if there's questions that I'm not able to answer here this afternoon, please jot them down and send them to the email director@dfw.wa.gov, and we'll do our best to get you those answers. So the first question that I have is, what are the percentages of how you are funded, in particular, Washington citizens' taxes versus licensing and hunting fees? That's a great question. And in general, when we look at there's three types of main types of payers into the agency, if you will: license payers, rate payers, and taxpayers. License payers that buy hunting and fishing licenses, as well as leveraging Pittman Robertson and Dingle Johnson funds, comprise about a third of the department's operating budget. The other 2/3 of the budget comes from the State General Fund, federal taxes and grants back to the department, as well as the ratepayer funding. So this would be electric ratepayer dollars that the public utility districts collect, and then we're funded by the PUD to help achieve their mitigation obligation for fish and wildlife impacts for managing that hydro system. So in short, about a third of the funding comes from licensing fees, and 2/3 comes from everybody else. I also think it's important to note that a hunter and fisher is also a ratepayer and also a taxpayer, and so they're per capita probably contributing higher than other citizens, but nonetheless, there's a lot more of taxpayer and ratepayers contributing to the overall agency budget. The next question I have is, has Fish and Wildlife considered canceling or closing programs to meet the budget needs? Yes, that is the work that we did in that zero-based budget analysis, where when we look at our problem statement for next biennium, we see a need for $33 million. As you'll note that we only submitted a request for $30 million. So there's $2.5 to $3 million of reductions that we're going to take on top of some of the reductions we already took this biennium to balance the budget. And just as a quick reminder, some of those reductions would be proposing shifting the production at the Natchez Hatchery to other facilities, the IT reductions, and reducing triploid trout. So some of that work we would just cease doing to try to minimize the size of the problem statement that would roll forward next biennium. So the next question is, has anyone looked into why there's been such a drop in fishing and hunting licenses? That's a great question, and it's something that we spent a fair amount of time with our budget and policy advisory group and with our commission about as we walked them through our budget. On a national level, we're seeing a decline in hunting and fishing participation. Don't know necessarily the cause and effect. Everybody's got their explanation, but as society has moved from more of a rural basis to an urban basis, or a competition for free time, the fact that younger generations are there's the phrase the nature deficit disorder, where folks are probably more plugged in on video entertainment and computers than they are getting outside and recreating. So it is a national trend. When we look at Washington data, we're seeing a decline in fishing. We're seeing participants in big game hunting staying level, and we're seeing a decline in small game hunting. And that's one that concerns me, because that's really the way a lot of us got started hunting is by pursuing small game. So there's a really high demand for big game hunting opportunities, more demand than what we can, that meets the public expectations, which is why we have our special permit opportunities and other ways to try to reduce the pressure and ensure that we have a sustainable wildlife resource. Let's see here. I'm trying to just read through and get to some other questions. So one of the things is, are there surveys that indicate what programs the public wants Fish and Wildlife to focus on? Yes, we partnered. There is a national survey that is being coordinated out of Colorado State University, and we've participated in that survey. We haven't seen the results back. They sent it out this past winter. We participated in it about 5 years ago and asked for public's perceptions of the type of work and services that the public expects that the Department of Fish and Wildlife conducts. So eager to see that result. On our website, there is the summary from the survey a few years ago. It's called Understanding People and Places Survey. And so that's a interesting resource. In it, you'll see folks, not only are wanting to participate on hunting and fishing, but there's a broad array of outdoor activities, whether it's watchable wildlife. We're seeing very different types of recreation on our wildlife areas than we have in the past. Things like rock climbing and mountain biking and other activities are being a lot more prevalent as folks are getting out and exploring and finding these public lands. It presents really new opportunities for us to engage the public on what are the values of those natural spaces, not only for fish and wildlife, but for other outdoor recreation opportunities. So There's a question about, can the rules be simplified to reduce the internal activity at Fish and Wildlife to save dollars and spending? Now that's a great question, and a couple thoughts on that response. It's common for us to hear, and I recognize if you're a new angler or hunter, and even if you're new to the state, you open up the pamphlet, or when I've traveled to other states and open up their pamphlet, it's intimidating because you don't know the geography and you're trying to figure out what's legal where, and wanting to be a law-abiding recreationist. So part of the challenge is that the rules are set up so that we're trying to maximize opportunity. And so we have, instead of, for instance, providing a very simple rule that would just be for all areas of the state, or maybe just the west side of the state for deer hunting, it comes down to like, well, in this game management unit, we actually have based on the surveys, we have a higher surplus of bucks. So let's change the rule there to provide more opportunity. Or in another area, we have additional antlerless opportunity. And wow, this would be a really good hunt because the landowners are concerned about modern firearm, but this would be a great opportunity for a muzzleloader hunt or an archery hunt. And so you can just see how those conversation over the years expands the rules and the complexity in order to optimize and maximize hunting and fishing opportunities. On the fish side, what we've done recently is we developed a Fish Washington application. You can download it from Google Apps or from the Macintosh store. I'm not sure how to call that smartphone, but download that application and it will let you know what are the rules available today or when you're planning your fishing trip for a particular body of water. And we keep it current with all of the emergency rules. That actually allowed us to save some money on producing the number of fish pamphlets that hit the street this year, because we're trying to direct people to download that app and use that when they're out in the field. Here's another question. Many people who use the department's lands and facilities are not hunting or fishing. A small amount of the Discover Pass funds go to the department. Have you looked into ways to increase the contributions of the non-hunting and non-fishing members of the public who use and enjoy department lands? That's a great question. So a little over 5 years ago, the legislature passed the Discover Pass. And the Discover Pass is required to be displayed when you're parking on state recreation lands managed by state parks, DNR, or Fish and Wildlife. The funds are allocated to the three agencies based on, let's see here, Parks gets 84% of the Discover Pass revenue, while DNR and Fish and Wildlife each receive 8%. The legislature directed the agencies to work with the Ruckelshaus Center this past year to look at simplifying all the different state and even federal recreation passes that are out there. The primary recommendation was to actually remove and extinguish the Discover Pass and replace it with a vehicle tabs. So increase the cost of vehicle tabs to pay for operation and maintenance of state recreation lands. The legislature received the report kind of just before session, and they directed the governor's office, who has a contract now with Washington State University, to kind of really roll up their sleeves and look at the financial details of some of those recommendations. So I expect the legislature will be, receiving proposals about what to do with state recreation lands passes. For our end, it's something that, as I indicated earlier, we're working on both an individual wildlife area basis on making sure that there's different user groups represented on our citizen advisory groups for each wildlife unit, as well as we're embarking on developing a statewide recreation strategy so that we're providing wildlife area managers with consistent guidance on how we can incorporate all the different types of recreation opportunities and do it in a manner that's consistent with the original intent of acquiring and managing that property for the fish and wildlife values. So rather than the department proposing, and in our long-term funding plan, we explore different ideas across other states or ideas that our advisory group had come up with on how to expand and diversify the department's funding proposals. Each of those, I think, takes a lot more public input and a lot more engagement, and it's something we're very interested in pursuing to try to expand the types of folks that are participating into conserving fish and wildlife. So the next question is, how about selling off unused and unmanaged lands instead of always saying fee increase? I think it's a really good question. Oftentimes, our lands, we have 33 wildlife areas, about 1 million acres in our portfolio, and 700 boat launch sites. Often, when you look at the deed restrictions that are placed on the parcels, or the funding strings that allowed us to acquire that land, it's not so much that you could just say, well, here's 1,000 acres, let's just sell that off and fund other activities of the department. Oftentimes that 1,000 acres would be like, okay, well, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, if you sell that 1,000 acres, you need to actually buy an equivalent amount of land because the money is tied to either a mitigation obligation or to a particular contract or an appropriation to achieve those values. So it's a lot more complicated than what it looks like just on the surface of just being able to just do a land sale. Certainly, we have our real estate services looking at some of those parcels, and where there's instances where a parcel is not consistent with our portfolio or mission, we have brought those forward, but it's very small acreages and it's very rare, and we have to address those conversion issues where it might come into effect. So I know I've butchered the complexity of that response, but if you have further questions, email us at director@dfw.wa.gov, and we'll follow up individually and try to get you some more details. So a question came in that says, where does the use of RCO's Critical Habitat Fund fit into the flexibility use scale? Why would the department keep purchasing land that already provides, in most cases, free critical habitat when funds for management that would otherwise fund other management? So the short answer is the capital budget in general is not very flexible. The project lists that are developed under the RCO's different funding categories of WWRP are very specific, and those lists go forward to the legislature saying, funding this particular project or not. The funding can't, for instance, be used for from a proposed land acquisition to, for instance, keeping a hatchery open. It's very specific and tied in statute to what the funding can go towards. There's rules in statute about how funding can trickle down within a project list. So I would encourage you to either, for more details, either contact RCO or again, email us at director@dfw.wa.gov, and we can get you more information. So I'm just checking in to see if we have any other questions. Okay, here's one. Did you just not hear the folks that fish and hunt? How can you increase the activity when you keep limiting the opportunity? That's a really good question. And as I acknowledged earlier about the challenges that face fish and wildlife conservation are not just for hunters and fishers to fund. We're proposing proposals that continue work, in some cases that was funded by hunters and fishers, and we're going to be asking the legislature to fund that through general tax dollars. In other instances, we haven't seen a fee increase since 2011, and we don't want to price people out from hunting and fishing, and we're very concerned about those optics that question indicates. But that's where, is there a modest fee increase that continues to fund some of those activities that really are, I think about it from a legislator's perspective. Let's just take pheasant hunting. So a non-native species, is that something that should be funded by the general taxpayer? Or is that something that should be funded by those that are wanting to hunt that bird species? In our proposals, we're saying, well, the cost of managing pheasants is going up, and we would like to continue to do that. There is demand for that opportunity, and we would be asking those particular hunters to continue it. When you look at some of our activities are setting aside the bulk of our work on conservation, but even on maintaining a hatchery, for instance. Hatchery fish are going to benefit, some cases, the food web, southern resident killer whales. In some cases, it's going to tribal trust obligations. In some cases, it's going to catch that's caught by commercial fishers and ending up in grocery stores and restaurants, and it's going to a recreational fishing opportunity. So who should fund that activity that funds all those different values? In some cases, we're looking at, here's a modest component that can be achieved through recreational fee increase. We recently worked with the legislature to do an increase on commercial license fees, and now we're coming back and asking for the majority, 2/3 of the funding proposal funded by general taxpayers. Another question is, what is the department doing to bring in more funding from non-consumptive user groups who enjoy or impact the resource? I think I touched on that a little bit earlier, it really comes back to we have a number of ideas in our long-term funding plan that I indicated that probably aren't ripe and ready to move forward in the 2019 session. Certainly we're engaged in tracking the conversations about the Discover Pass or what might replace that if the legislature elects to do something differently. We are looking at ways of we recognize that the general citizens that enjoy the natural resources and bounty in WDFW that aren't hunters and fishers, that's where the general taxpayer revenue, I think, is that broad-based funding source to fund a number of those critical activities. And the next question that I have is, what have we learned from the restoration of wolves, mountain goats, and grizzlies that we can factor into future budgeting efforts? Wow, that's a really good question. I think we could take that a lot of different locations. I think the big thing is the importance of keeping common species common in the first place. When we have the situation where species are federally listed and there's increased requirements for critical habitat designations or habitat that has been altered and then we're intervening and trying to restore it, that's far more expensive than working with partners to try to protect and conserve the current habitat values that are on that parcel and keeping those species already common. So I know there's a number of species listed there that have their own whole other story with wolves and grizzlies, but I think the primary lesson learned is to keep common species common and try to avoid those scenarios where when you're trying to bring species back, and I'm speaking in a pretty general sense, but think about from salmon restoration efforts. There are capital projects for estuaries that are very costly, but very important and very critical for that watershed. And it is critical habitat to keep that stock, to sustain that stock. But it would have been a lot easier if that habitat hadn't been degraded to where we needed to intervene and try to restore it. Another question is, what is the department doing to engage our federal delegation to reverse the projected decline and instead expand federal matching for state recovery efforts through Dingell-Johnson, Pittman-Robertson, or the like? That's a great question. What we're seeing on the federal front is either flat funding, which is essentially a loss of buying power because of inflation, or in some cases, declines. So Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson are an excise tax that where there's an inflation on those goods and equipment, we tend to see those contracts increase accordingly. During the last administration, Pittman-Robertson was really strong, and I think that primarily had to do with concerns about gun control laws and availability of ammunition, more so than anything else. There is a federal bill that's out there right now called Recovering America's Wildlife Act. I think this is a really important legislation, and our commission actually adopted a position statement on it. It's available on our website under the commission tab, and that's to really support the funding that would come from federal oil and gas leases to fund each state's wildlife action plan. So a number of years ago, there was some funding for states to develop a comprehensive plan to do what I just described in the earlier question, which is try to sustain species before they become imperiled. And the states went through and identified their species of greatest conservation needs. And when they totaled up and looked at what it would take to implement it, it's a pretty significant number. This bill, the Recovery's America's Wildlife Act, would fully implement those plans. So pretty exciting opportunity. It's bipartisan legislation, and it just would encourage you to learn more about that program. So looks like we're just going to have time here for a few more questions. We'll probably try to wrap up around 8:30. So the next question is, how soon could the proposal go through for youth hunters and family hunting packages? What about the mentorship program? That's a great question. So the proposal about the aligning the youth hunters and the Hunter Ed graduate coupon concept, if we submit that and the commission approves that package moving forward, it goes to the governor's office, and if the governor's office gives a green light on it, that could go into effect, probably, depending on where the legislature's at in their session, but probably April of 2019 and go into effect next July 1st. So still a ways out there. We are looking at, and we do have the authority to offer a variety of bundled packages. This bill would really make that authority very explicit, and it would allow us to be a little bit more creative than what the flexibility we currently have. So I think it's it's kind of that solution where department, why don't you try to solve some of your own problems here and look at those recruitment tools on licensing and creative packages where it's still an affordable activity, but we're trying to enlist more people into the heritage. A question is, can I elaborate on the concept of separating the state wildlife account into the unrestricted account and a composite of the different restricted accounts? Yeah, I'll try to. So again, that account has 26 different buckets in it, if you will. 25 of them are set up as sub-accounts that have a unique statute that established it. The personalized license plate, the auction and raffle permits, the two-pole endorsement, etc. The other account, which is more than half of the account, is what we call the unrestricted account, and it's where hunting and fishing license revenue is deposited. The benefit that was included in the matrix report recommendations of separating the 25 restricted accounts from the single large unrestricted account is to provide more visibility. When the legislature looks at the state wildlife account, they see it in total, and they might see a series of fund balances that's parked in 25 individual accounts, look at that total and say, well, Department of Fish and Wildlife, there's still revenue there. We don't need to offer a fee adjustment. When in actuality, yes, there's revenue there, but it goes to very specific items like wildlife rehab or personalized license plates. And a lot of that money is not generated from hunting and fishing license fees. It's generated from background plates or personalized plates. So that's the concept of separating that large account into two different bins. There's a question here that says, not sure if Fish and Wildlife has the input or control, but what about thinning the forest before Mother Nature does? Boy, that's a great question. And it's something that's pretty high on our to-do list. The department recently developed a forest management plan, and I think it was passed or finalized maybe 2, possibly 3 years ago. But of the 1 million acres of land on the 33 wildlife areas, about 250,000 acres are of a forest habitat type. We previously, for years, we had a single forester, and we would try to treat, and by treat, I mean thin or log, about 200 acres a year. We've really embraced prescribed fire, trying to get in and doing pre-commercial thinning, in particular on east side forests, where we can try to return ponderosa pine forest types into a more natural state where it's a lot less dense of forest type, as well as returning disturbance, fire disturbance on a more regular regime through prescribed fire. Because yes, you're exactly right. When we don't have that treatment going into places where we're seeing that catastrophic wildfire. In some of our forest habitat types, either because of other biological restrictions or slope concerns, et cetera, those would be off limits. And then some of our west side lands might require a nudge to get it in a certain direction, perhaps a pre-commercial treatment, but it might not need the prescribed fire or some other type of intensive management to get it on the trajectory that best resembles a more natural state. Let's see here. We'll go with this as our last question. It says, has the possibility of including access to WDFW lands in the Good to Go Pass program with an associated fee? No, we have not explored that. That's an interesting idea. We've really, in our work with the Budget and Policy Advisory Group, we've really have deferred because there's already another legislative appointed group through the Ruckelshaus process to look at funding for state managed lands. And so we've shifted our attention and kind of let that other group tackle some of those issues. And I'm now saying, here's the last question. Is there the ability to pursue shared services such as IT or administrative functions and enforcement by partnering with other agencies? You know, that's a really good question. And we have explored that in a number of areas. In particular, we've when parks, for instance, had staffing shortfall, we've been able to, rather than us hiring temporary staff, we were able to partner and bring on some of parks employees to manage some of our lands or water access sites. We've partnered where we have staff, because of their expertise, work with other agencies on their big projects, for instance, with the federal natural resource agencies. But probably at the scale that I'm reading into this question about, has there been a broad scale sharing, for instance, of IT services or things like that, we haven't explored that. I think that would be something that the different central cost services or central services like the Department of Enterprise Services or others, we'd want to work with them to make sure that the agency's needs are met and we're able to leverage resources accordingly. Sometimes you have limitations associated with different fund sources that can be a bit of a challenge, but I think that's an area to park in the room for continuous improvement. I really want to thank everybody for joining the webinar tonight. Again, this will be recorded and posted tomorrow morning. I want to encourage people to take a look at the survey that's posted on our website. There were a number of other questions and suggestions. We'll carry all those forward and consider them with the others that were shared tonight. Also, there are a number of people who are advising against a license fee increase. I wanted to say out loud that we hear that. I encourage all of you to take that survey, and I want to reach out with any additional questions you have to please use the contact information that's shared on the screen. So with that, I hope you have a great night, and thank you so much for spending some time with us to learn more about the department's activities, our budget, and some of our proposals for the 2019 legislative session. Take care.